All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Creation Myths. Here we are talking today. We are doing part two in what is a three-part series of basically excerpts from my real life class. Today's topic is the evolution of altruism. How do evolutionary processes explain altruistic behaviors? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, before we get into it, let me just kind of, kind of contextualize what we're doing and remind everybody kind of what we're doing here. Actually, the first thing I'll say is just chat. Just let me know if the sound and everything seems okay. If everybody can hear and see everything fine. So if there's any issues, I can take care of it. Other than that, let me tell you what we're doing here. So last week, we talked about the evolution of virulence, the property of host pathogen interactions that results in the host experiencing disease symptoms. And we went through the evolutionary dynamics of how that works and how virulence would evolve. Right. And we ended up talking about inter versus intra host competition and how that leads to selection for greater or lesser degrees of virulence. Now, today we are going to talk about a different topic. We're going to talk about the evolution of altruistic behavior, behavior that an individual does that benefits other members of their population at their own expense. And as we'll talk about, that seems to present a bit of a paradox for evolution. How do you select for something that hurts your own fitness? And we're going to get into all of that. And then next week, in part three in this series, we're going to talk about the evolutionary dynamics of cancer. And it may seem like those three topics, virulence, altruism, and cancer, are three distinct topics. But one thing that I want to emphasize right now, so we're prepared as we go through tonight and into next week, is that these three topics actually all go together. It's not three individual things in their own silo that I just think are cool, so we're going to talk about them. No, it's not like that. Instead, these three topics all work together. And when we get to the evolution of cancer, we're going to build on the first 2 weeks to explain what we're going to see next week. So that's just to kind of put us in kind of where we are and what we're doing in terms of this series of topics that we're going to talk about here. So remember, just like last week, one weird thing that we're doing tonight that is different from what we normally do on this channel is this has nothing to do with creationism at all. We're not talking about it. It's just not relevant to what we're doing tonight. And the other thing I just want to remind everybody of before we get going is that I'm trying to make this as close to the kind of dynamics of one of my classes as possible. Now, obviously, we're online, we're not in a room where we're all directly talking. But when you have questions, as we're going through this material tonight, put your questions in the chat. I'll put them up on screen if I like them. We'll talk about it. And I think we had some really good interactions last week. People asking really good, interesting questions that were, really relevant to the topic. And so feel free to do that again. I think that worked really well last week. So let's keep that dynamic going as we go through tonight's topic. So let's get right into it. Tonight's topic is how evolution explains virulence. And I just want to say, I see as we're doing this live, I see over 30 people here. That makes me so happy. Thank you all for joining me for this. I love talking about this stuff, and it's really nice to see so many of you here live wanting to hear about it. That just warms my heart. So thank you for being here, everybody. Let's get into this really fun topic. Now, just like last week, I'm going to start this with the learning outcomes, just like I do in my class. So the learning outcomes for this topic are, first, we want to sequence how behaviors can evolve. What does that process look like? Very broad strokes. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of details here, but we want to have an understanding of how behaviors can actually evolve via selection. Then we want to compare and contrast the costs and benefits of being social, right? So you have organisms living in a social group rather than in a solitary fashion. We want to look at the costs and benefits of kind of that style of living. That's just going to be on one slide, but that's going to be our lead in directly into altruism And that's going to allow us to then get to our third outcome, sequence the evolution of altruism. So we want to look at the existence of altruistic behaviors, see what does that mean, and then ask if we can determine the evolutionary basis for those behaviors. Do we have an explanation that allows us to explain how those seemingly paradoxical behaviors are actually going to evolve and how they're going to be adaptive? How are the alleles associated with those behaviors going to increase in frequency? All right, so that's where we're going tonight. That's where we're going to be doing. So let's get right into it here. Well, the first thing we have to talk about is that behavior can be a phenotype, can be a phenotype. That means that behavior can be a trait that has a genetic basis. Okay, so we've got a lot of examples of this, and I'll give you some examples of this as we go. But here is a really simple representation of it. This is a figure, and I'm going to show a lot of figures from this book. This is a figure from Zimmer and Emlyn evolution textbook called Evolution Making Sense of Life. I've shown it before. I've got it on my shelf right down there. This is one of the figures from that book. I like this book a lot. It has really nice figures. And you can pick up the older editions very inexpensively online. So I encourage you, if you're into just kind of basic evolution kind of stuff, the Zimmer and Emlyn book, Evolution Making Sense of Life, is a really excellent resource to just kind of have on hand that you can refer to when you have questions about, the basics of evolutionary theory. So in this figure, it's really simple what's going on here. We're looking at the distribution of this trait within the population. And this is basically looking at the aggressiveness of the squirrel. So it's the distance traveled before the squirrel runs. You've got some squirrels that are more timid. You have some that are more bold. And each side of that distribution is going to come with costs and benefits. So, like, if you are very timid, then you're going to do a better job avoiding predation, but you're not going to accumulate as many resources because you're just not willing to go out and venture as far to get resources. On the other side of things, if you are very adventurous and exploratory, then you're going to obtain resources more readily. But it's also a more dangerous way to just go about your life. So, like, you might get eaten more frequently. Now, which of these kind of behaviors is optimal? Well, that's what selection is going to decide, right? You're going to have selection based on those behaviors, and then the ones that are optimal, those are the ones that are going to survive to adulthood and have the most kids, right? So, and the alleles that promote that optimal behavior will increase in frequency. Okay, this is the basic idea of how behavior can be a phenotype. Now, I want to be very clear about something before I continue on. And this is a really, really important point. Behaviors can be a phenotype, but they do not have to be a phenotype. In fact, most behaviors, when we're talking about humans especially, most behaviors are not genetically determined or have a genetic component. They are going to be socially determined. Okay, so this is really important. There are behaviors that have a genetic basis. Most of the time, they don't. So, therefore, those behaviors, those non genetic behaviors, can they evolve? No. You can't evolve something if there's no genetic component to it, right? Selection can't operate if there's no genetic component to a certain trait, whether it's a morphological trait or a behavioral phenotype. So just keep that in mind. There is a very loud, I'll say, field of hesitant to call it a field of evolutionary biology that is all about this, and that is the field of evolutionary psychology. And let me just go to a live view of the field of evolutionary psychology right now. Evolutionary psychology is an absolute dumpster fire. It is terrible. It's bad psychology. It's even worse. Evolutionary biology. There is no redeeming qualities to the field of evolutionary psychology. It is terrible. They use terribly designed, poorly controlled studies with tiny sample sizes to draw outsized conclusions with no basis. They just completely misunderstanding like how evolutionary processes work. Um, Everything about evolutionary psychology is bad, and I think that there's an evolutionary biologist I know who I greatly respect, and their take on evolutionary psychology is I'm going to convey it. you, and I think this basically sums up the field. Evolutionary psychology is a field that exists to justify senior faculty sleeping with their graduate students. That's it. That's what evolutionary psychology is. It's basically enforcing, 1950s social hierarchies. Uh, and we don't need to talk about evolutionary psychology anymore. It's trash. I hate it. It's bad science. You can just anytime you encounter evolutionary psychology, just ignore it. It's terrible. It needs to go away. So now we'll move on. Is that Steven Pinker's field? I think it is. I think it is. There's a lot of big names in evolutionary psychology. There's, yeah, um, yeah, there's a lot of big names in evolutionary psychology that get problems. Um, okay, so let's talk about real science. Let's look at how there are specific genes that can influence behavior. We have we've documented specific genes that affect specific behaviors. And this figure, again, from the same textbook, using a lot of their figures, shows some of the ones that we've documented. So, like for example, you've got this PER gene is courtship communication in fruit flies. EGR1 is really interesting because it's common in a lot of different species and it does different things, but it's the same gene. It's a homologous gene, but it does different things in different species. And then this one I just want to talk about for a moment down here, V1AR in prairie voles. This one has to do with vasopressin levels. That is a hormone, vasopressin. And vasopressin is really interesting in prairie voles because it actually, like, quite directly determines the mating system. So you can have prairie voles that are polygamous, and if you increase the amount of vasopressin that they express, they become monogamous because it's involved in like mate pair bonding. So that's like a very direct kind of thing. Like you turn up the amount of vasopressin, it actually very starkly changes their reproductive behavior. That's kind of an exception for these kinds of things. What we tend to see are there genes or there are specific alleles that are like associated with different behaviors or lead to predispositions for different behaviors. It's relatively uncommon for it to be like a one-to-one thing like that, but there are a few examples of that. So you should all know that there are examples where you can like this specific allele promotes this specific behavior. Like there are examples like that. Everybody okay? Let's keep going. So let's keep going here. Now, what are the implications of this? Right? If we have specific alleles that affect specific behaviors, the implications are that behavior can evolve via selection. You can impose a selective pressure for or against specific behaviors, and that's going to lead to a change in the frequencies of the alleles that promote those behaviors. And this figure shows the results of a simple experiment that demonstrate this point. This is looking at the activity level of mice. So if you have mice in, a little cage or something, they're going to, you give them the little wheel that they'll run on, they'll just do that wheel spontaneously, however much every day. And what was discovered is that you could actually select for mice that have higher activity. They're going to do more of that mouse wheel each day. So if you look here at this figure, we're looking across 30 generations. So we're looking for generations 0 to 30 on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we have wheel revolutions per day from 2,000 up to 16,000. And what we see here, the blue lines are the control lines. So those are non-selected. And you see that's like somewhere in the 4 to 6,000 range on average, what you get there. The red lines are the selected lines for high activity. And after 30 generations, we've selected for mice that are moving in the 10 to 12 to 14,000 revolutions per day range. So this is just a very simple example of how you can select for particular behaviors. And the fact that you can do this means there must be a genetic basis for this behavior. Right? There's some alleles that you're selecting for that are promoting higher levels of activity in those selected lines. Okay, so we can select for behavior. That's the idea that I want to get here. There are some behaviors we can actively select for them. Here are a couple more examples of this. You can do kind of similar things. You could select for aggressiveness in rodents. just measuring the number of attacks over 8 generations, you could see that the number goes up when you're selecting for it, stays approximately flat when you're not. And you could also select for and against the willingness to explore in certain species of birds. So this is the exploration score. It's basically like how far and for how long are the birds willing to leave their nest. And across just 4 generations, you can see you can actually select for fairly stark differences in this trait, which means obviously there are going to be there's a genetic component for these phenotypic traits. Here's a question here. So how did the experimenters actually carry out the selection process? They're basically in your initial population. It's not that everybody is going to be exactly the same. You're going to have a distribution, whether it's activity, aggressiveness, whatever the trait is, you're going to have a distribution in there. So what you do is you say, okay, the highest activity mice, for example, are only going to mate with the other high activity mice, and the low activity mice, or you just do random for the control line, right? You don't dictate who mates with who. But for the high activity line, you say only the highest activity mice in each generation, the highest 10% or the highest 20% or whatever, only those highest activity mice are going to reproduce. And over time, that imposes directional selection in that population. It becomes more and more active, right? So you're imposing artificial selection to show how the trait can actually be selected for. Yeah, it's selective breeding. Yep, you got it. Cool. Okay, so now we've established that some behaviors have a genetic component and can therefore be subject to selection. So before we get to altruism specifically, let's change gears just for one slide and answer this question. Why be social? Because being social, living in a large group of individuals of the same species rather than on your own or in a smaller group actually comes with a lot of costs associated with it. So here are those costs. You're going to be more visible to predators, right? It's easy to find a group of individuals compared to just one. You also have to deal with more competition. That's competition for resources, competition for mates, whatever the case is, right? If you're in a population, you just have to deal with more individuals around you, more competition. And depending on the specific context, there have been some studies looking at this. There's one particular one. I can't remember the authors off the top of my head, but it was a really interesting study having to do with kind of isolated coral reefs and looking at competition within a population compared to between species. And in certain conditions, the competition within a population, so the intra-specific competition, is actually a stronger competition than the competition that exists between species. And that tends to scale, and think about just intuitively, this makes sense, that tends to scale with things like population size and population density, right? Just all else being equal, if there's more of you or you're more dense, that leads to more competition. You also, as this is for males specifically, but you have to deal with uncertain paternity in larger populations. That's less certain paternity. So females have certain maternity, right? Like female laid the egg, she knows that egg is hers. But males have what is called uncertain paternity because you can never quite be sure if that egg or those offspring are biologically theirs. And when you have small groups or individuals mating, that's kind of easier to be sure that those kids are yours. But in a large population, where everyone's kind of together, it becomes less certain. So you have this challenge of less certainty over paternity. Larger populations also facilitate more disease transmission, so that's a problem. And then there's a really interesting dynamic around cheaters. Cheaters are individuals who, in some way, are not pulling their weight in the population. You can hilariously find this in ants, for example, where you'll have ants that like pretend to go out and work all day, but actually they'll just not work. They'll just like eat food, and then they go back to the burrow at the end of the day, and like basically do all the signaling and all the communication to be like, wow, that sure was a busy day, guys. Time to get in line for my meal. And that's a problem in larger populations. You have this free rider problem. And those cheaters can actually be selected for until they become a critical mass of the population, then it kind of becomes unsustainable. But as the population grows, you do see cheaters and free riders becoming an issue. Now, all that being said, there's a whole lot of examples of species that are social. So obviously, there have to be benefits that exceed the cost in order for that to be kind of a mode of living that is selected for. So let's look at those benefits, right? If you live in a larger group, you have greater vigilance against like predators, right? You have just more eyes, you see more predators coming. Related to that, you also have what's called the dilution effect. And this is just like think about like a herd of gazelle, right, running from lions or cheetahs or something. You don't have to be the fastest gazelle. The effect is just the fact that you don't have to be the slowest, right? As long as you're not the slowest, you're good. Another kind of funny illustration of the dilution effect is when you've got all the penguins right on the edge of the ice, and there's like an orca that's ready to eat the penguins. And like, if one penguin goes, that penguin is totally getting eaten. But if all penguins go at once, there's a good chance you won't get eaten. Maybe one or two of them are going to have bad luck, but the rest are, going to be fine. That's the dilution effect. You're better able to defend yourself, right? An individual can fight other organisms, but a group is going to be better at that. And then you have cooperative foraging and hunting, which is a really big deal. So think about species that are pack hunters, and it really is like a really overpowered strategy in the world. Like pack hunting is just the best strategy when it comes to hunting your prey. Um, in a lot of cases, it's not a universal thing, but in a lot of cases, pack hunting is where it's at. And then the final thing on this list, which is obviously the lead into what we're going to get to, is you have altruism, right? You have altruistic behavior, which we're going to define and everything, but basically, I'm going to give up resources to help the people around me, right? It hurts me, it helps the people around me. That's altruistic behavior. And on net, the idea is that is a benefit for that population. So we want to understand how that can evolve. That's really weird. And we just got the question in the chat from Sydney Raptor right here. Yeah, altruism seems kind of confusing. If it improves the circumstances of others, but not yourself, and you don't reproduce, you get killed being altruistic, you don't pass it on as a trait. That, my friends, is exactly the paradox that we are going to resolve. And it's really cool. So we're gonna explain how we get around this. So let's get into altruism here. Okay. Now, the problem is that we typically think of selecting for traits that are going to benefit the individual that does the trait. And when we're talking about behaviors, we would think that we're going to see selection for selfish behaviors, right? It's going to benefit me. I'm going to get more resources at the expense of the people I'm competing with around me. So if you have unselfish behaviors, that raises a really interesting question. How can you what first of all, why would you do it? Like, how does that work? And then how would such a behavior be selected for? How can you select for something that's going to be a detriment to yourself? Because some of you in the chat are hitting the nail directly on the head. If I do a behavior that hurts me, my fitness goes down. So how will the alleles for that behavior increase in frequency? Right? It seems like a paradox, but trust me, we are going to explain that paradox, and it is so cool. To preview a little bit of next week, it's going to be relevant for the underlying dynamics for the evolution of cancer within a single individual. It's really cool how all this stuff fits together. So let's answer this question, and then next week we'll kind of build on this as part of what we do for that topic. So altruistic behavior, the idea here is we're going to decrease the individual's fitness who does the behavior. And as a result of that, you're going to increase the fitness of the other individuals in the population. And my favorite example of this is alarm calling. This is like such a quintessential example of altruistic behavior. And also, I get to use this amazing picture of a ground squirrel. You may think that is like an AI picture. It is not. I promise you, I didn't put in like ground squirrel making an alarm call into like some AI picture generator thing. That is a real picture from the National Park Service of a ground squirrel yelling as loud as it can. So We see this behavior of making an alarm call, in response to a predator, being seen, in birds, we see it in insects, we see it in rodents, right? And the idea here is that you're gonna warn everybody in your population. You're gonna say, "Ah, I see a predator," right? The problem is that everybody in your population hears, "Ah, it's a snake. Get underground, hide from the snake, run, everybody run, there's a predator." But what the predator hears is, "Hey, I'm over here, come eat me," right? So the alarm calling makes the individual who does the alarm call more conspicuous and therefore more likely to get eaten by the predator. And if you get eaten by the predator, how does that affect your future fitness? How does that affect your future reproductive output? Turns out getting eaten tends to be bad for your future ability to have kids. So making an alarm call is a quintessential altruistic behavior, right? It is going to help the fitness, it's going to benefit the fitness of the people around you at a cost to your own fitness, which again, that's the paradox we need to explain. How do we make that work? How can we select for that behavior despite the costs associated with it? So let's look at how this should work. Now, again, what we expect to be the case is you should maximize your own fitness rather than exhibit behaviors that help other individuals. But we have this groundbreaking idea from W.D. Hamilton from 1964. His idea was that evolution, selection, doesn't distinguish basically between the sources for alleles. You could have an allele that's transmitted directly from one individual to their offspring. You could have that same allele that's transmitted from relatives to their offspring. And selection doesn't care. It's just, is that allele moving to the next generation? And the source, whether it's direct from an individual or indirect via their relatives, right? The source actually doesn't matter in terms of whether that allele is going to be selected for or not. The question is, does that allele increase in frequency, right? The question is not, from whom does that allele transmit, okay? So let's talk about this concept that comes from Hamilton called inclusive fitness, which is the sum of two components of fitness when we're looking at specific alleles. And I want to just preface this by saying this gets into a very kind of gene centric, selfish gene way of thinking about things, because we're talking about fitness in the context of alleles here, right? Of specific genetic traits, right? It's the sum of direct and indirect fitness. So let's define those terms. Direct fitness is your alleles passed down vertically to your own offspring, right? That's direct fitness. Your alleles represented in your kids in the next generation. Indirect fitness are those same alleles, the alleles you possess, but they are passed from other members of the population to their offspring. So it's those same alleles going from parent to child, but it's through other members of that population. That still counts as like fitness for those alleles, right? It's those alleles moving to the next generation. It's not reproduction, fitness, but it's not yours. It's somebody else's. So we call that indirect fitness. And when you combine direct and indirect fitness, we call that concept inclusive fitness, right? It's the total representation of those alleles in the next generation, independent of the source. Now, this is kind of a weird way to think about fitness, right? Is everybody okay with this? Do we have any questions about this concept of inclusive fitness? Do you have any questions about that? Because this is a very different way from how we normally think about fitness. We're going to get there. What's that famous quote? I give my life for two cousins before half. We're going to get there. Don't worry. We're going to get there. I like how a bunch of you in the chat basically know where this is going. That, like, you can see the dots, you know kind of what the deal is. I love it. Okay, I haven't gotten any specific questions. Let's see here. Um, does indirect fitness explain why you can be altruistic to our group, a hostile to out? It has to do with relatedness. We're gonna see an example of this. We'll get there. Yeah. Okay. So let's continue onwards. Everyone's on the same page here. So the question is, who shares your alleles? Right? It's about other people with your alleles passing them on to their offspring. That's your indirect fitness. Who shares your alleles? Close relatives share your alleles. So looking at this figure, we need to define a term here. That term is R, lowercase r, and that's the coefficient of relatedness. Now, R is a very specific thing. It's the likelihood of sharing an allele due to common ancestry, right? It's not how genetically similar are you. So when you look at siblings, right, if they have the same allele for a certain gene, right, the likelihood that they got that allele from the same parent is zero point 0.5, right? Mom or dad, right? Zero point 0.5. Okay. So that does not mean that two siblings are 50% identical to each other. It's not what that means. It's the probability or the likelihood of sharing an allele due to a common ancestry. So we can look at different relationships and we can see that there are different coefficients of relatedness. So, like, for example, offspring, the coefficient of relatedness is zero point 0.5, siblings, it's zero point 0.5, grandchildren, it's 0.25 because it's two steps. So if you look at the figure, right, it's zero point 0.5 grandparent to parent, and then zero point 0.5 parent to offspring. So those two steps, you multiply them together, zero point 0.5 times zero point 0.5 gets you a coefficient of relatedness between grandchildren and grandparents of 0.25, which is this long arrow right here, right? So half siblings, nephews, nieces, that's going to be 0.25. Cousins are 1/8, that's 0.125. So that's zero point 0.5 times zero point 0.5 times zero point 0.5, right? That's cousins. These two individuals down here are cousins. And you can just calculate up the steps, and it's zero point 0.5 times zero point 0.5 times zero point 0.5, and that gets you to 0.125. Is everybody okay with coefficient of relatedness and why this matters so far? Right? This is going to be really important for inducing selection for altruistic behavior. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. And some of you in the chat are talking about a famous quote from JBS Haldane, and we're going to get there. I promise you, we're going to get there. So this leads to the relatedness figure, the coefficients of relatedness, and the fact that you share alleles with your close relatives leads to a phenomenon called kin selection. This is selection that is due to the indirect benefits of altruistic behaviors that help your relatives. In other words, indirect benefits that cause the alleles of your relatives to be present in the next generation, right? The indirect fitness. It's your behavior causes that number to go up. And this is where we get to a really fun kind of quote from JBS Haldane and talking about essentially this concept where somebody, and I forget, maybe somebody in the chat knows who, kind of posed the question, but it was, it was something along the lines of, would you jump into a river to save your drowning brother? Would you risk your life to save, your brother if your brother was drowning? And he said, no, but I would for two brothers or eight cousins, because that would make the relatedness kind of level out, right? If you're putting you being one, right, one individual, one unit of fitness that's you're risking your life, then the benefits of that has to add up to the same amount. So brothers being, full siblings being zero point 0.5 coefficient of relatedness, it would take two to equalize out. Cousins, it would take eight to equalize out. That's the joke, right? No, but I would for two brothers or eight cousins is a fantastic line. So let's be a little more formal about this, though. Why is it two brothers or eight cousins? Well, kin selection is adaptive when the beneficiaries are close relatives, because the closer the relatives, the more related you are, which means the more likely you are to share specific alleles, right? So your alleles are more likely to benefit if the beneficiaries of that altruistic behavior are close relatives. When there are high indirect benefits, right? If more individuals are going to benefit, then you could potentially select for that behavior. And when the direct costs are low, when it's a relatively low risk behavior, it doesn't impact your fitness as much. That would also that would also kind of facilitate a situation where altruistic behavior is adaptive. And we can be a little bit more formal. We can describe the conditions, but we can actually describe them mathematically. And this is called Hamilton's rule. Hamilton's rule describes the specific conditions when altruism, or I should say when alleles for altruism, will be favored by selection. So it's a very simple expression here. So you've got R is the coefficient of relatedness that we talked about before. Capital B represents the indirect fitness benefits, right? So how many more kids do those other people have, for example, right? By what frequency do those alleles increase due to this behavior? And then C represents the direct fitness cost. And what this shows you is that if the relatedness times the benefit exceeds the direct costs, then those alleles will ultimately increase in frequency, right? So I'm going to put the words for this up on screen because this can be hard to wrap your head around. It's not intuitive when you first see it. So I'm going to spell, I don't normally like to have a ton of words on screen, but I'm going to spell this out pretty, much just spell it out in plain English on screen. And I hope that helps everyone kind of wrap their heads around this not always intuitive concept here. So I'm just going to read this. What this means is that if a behavior increases the likelihood of an allele appearing in subsequent generations via relative offspring by a greater magnitude than it decreases the likelihood of it appearing in your offspring, that behavior will be selected for despite the cost to the individuals who do that behavior, right? If the benefit to the frequency of that allele indirectly is greater in magnitude than the direct cost, you're still going to select for that behavior in spite of the direct cost. And the result of this, if you dig into the actual genetics, is that the alleles that promote the altruistic behavior will ultimately increase in frequency. And I want to be very clear about this. There is no intentionality here. There's no deciding what behaviors are good or bad or whatever. This is just brute force selection and population genetics. If the direct benefit in terms of the frequency of those alleles in the population is greater in magnitude, or sorry, if the indirect benefit, excuse me, if the indirect benefit in terms of the frequency of those alleles in the population is greater in magnitude than the direct cost, right, the reduction in your direct fitness, then just mathematically, those alleles will necessarily increase in frequency. And that means they're being selected for. Like that's what to be selected for means, right? They're increasing in frequency due to differences in reproductive success. So, this is just very bare bones population genetics math that explains how altruistic behavior can ultimately be selected for. How do we feel about this, everybody? Is this okay? Is everyone following me? We're going to show it graphically. I'm going to show you an example with data. We're not just going to stop. We're going to make sure we're good with this. But how do we feel so far? Is everybody kind of following along in the chat? I know there's a delay and it's awkward, but in class it's awkward too when I say, okay, what questions do you have? And then it's just like silence. And for anybody who currently teaches or is thinking you might teach at some point, embrace the awkward silence. Just wait them out. Somebody's going to get impatient and say something before you do. You just got to embrace the awkward silence. And also, here's another little trick for people. Instead of saying, does anybody have any questions? Ask, what questions do you have? Just that tiny little difference tends to get more people to ask questions. It's a little tip for you if you find yourself in front of the classroom at some point. All right, let's continue. Everyone says we're good, so let's do it. Okay, here's just a simple schematic representation of how kin selection works, how it can promote altruistic behavior. Now, in this example right here, on the y-axis, we have inclusive fitness, your total fitness. And these are just arbitrary units, just making up numbers to illustrate your point, to illustrate the point we're making here. And what we're going to see is we're going to see two bars. We're going to see one without altruism and one with altruism. And in each bar, we have three numbers. In red, we have your direct fitness. In blue, we have your indirect fitness. And then on top, in black, we have your total inclusive fitness. So in our hypothetical schematic situation here, we're looking at an individual where they're not doing any altruistic behavior. They have 1 unit of direct fitness and 1 unit of indirect fitness for a total inclusive fitness of 2 units. And again, these are arbitrary numbers, just making up numbers to illustrate the point. But what this means is whatever 2 means in this situation, that's going to be the relative representation of their alleles in the next generation. Now, if we have alleles for altruism that are favored, right, they satisfy the inequity I showed you a minute ago, RB is greater than C, then it might look something like this, where you have a direct fitness cost. Your direct fitness is reduced from 1 unit of fitness to zero point 0.5 units of fitness due to your altruistic behavior. Your giving up resources, you're making alarm calls, whatever the case is, you suffer a direct fitness cost. But if those same behaviors lead to an increase in your indirect fitness from 1 unit of fitness to 2 units of fitness, your total inclusive fitness in that situation has increased from 2 units of fitness to 2.5 units of fitness. That means that your alleles, and specifically the alleles for altruistic behavior, are going to increase in frequency more when you do the altruism compared to when you don't, which means that the alleles for altruistic behavior will be selected for, and you're going to have individuals that then have these alleles at a greater frequency as generations progress. Okay, so we're going to see over generations the increase in frequency of the altruism promoting alleles due to the indirect benefit exceeding the magnitude of the direct cost. And again, these are like fake numbers, right? These are fake numbers. I'm just making up numbers to illustrate the point, but this is just kind of a schematic representation of the point. And I really like what Zach says here. This is great. Yeah, this makes more sense if you view the alleles as the individual with the organism just as the vehicle of the allele. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's really the selfish gene paradigm that we're looking at here, where kind of the unit is the allele rather than the individual that happens to possess the allele. Yeah, we're looking at the alleles and the frequency of those and how they transmit in the population. Absolutely. Perfect. The gene-centric view, as Andrew said. So here is my favorite example of this that shows like a real life example of this where the predictions from Hamilton's rule actually exactly match the real world behaviors that we see. I think this is so cool. So we're talking here about ground squirrels, and ground squirrels are interesting in terms of their population structure. The way ground squirrels work is males, when they reach adolescence, they leave the population that they're born into, and they will join another population and they'll mate with the females in the new population that they join. Females, on the other hand, stay in the population where they're born for their entire lives. And this leads to some very stark differences in relatedness between males and females in the ground squirrel populations. The males are only related to their kids, right? Male comes from another group, mates with a female, and then has kids. So the only genetic relatives of males in these populations are their direct offspring and their grandchildren if they live long enough. If they have female kids, then they have grandkids. Now, females, on the other hand, they stay in the population their whole lives. So the females have a very high degree of relatedness to a lot of individuals. It's a lot of grandmothers and mothers and sisters and nieces and aunts and cousins, right? The females have very high relatedness to all of the other members of that population, with the exception of the males that come from somewhere else. Okay. So now this figure shows some really interesting findings here. So we're breaking this population up both by sex and by age cohorts. So we have the juvenile females and males, we have the adolescent, the 1 year females and males, and then we have the adult females and males. And on the y axis, we have the frequency of alarm calling. Now, remember, alarm calling is like the textbook altruistic behavior. It helps the people around you, but like you might get eaten, right? So that's about as altruistic as you can get. So we have two sets of data here. We have the solid dark blue line That indicates the expected amount of alarm calling within each of these kind of groups in the population based just on their frequency in the population. So, the most common type of individual in the population is the adult females. About 40% of the population is adult females. We expect them to make about 40% of the alarm calls, right? The adult males are like 25 to 30%. That's what we expect. 1 year females, 20-ish, 1 year males, 12%, right? We expect the alarm calling to just like match your frequency in the population. That's our kind of null hypothesis. What we actually find are the light blue bars. We find the juveniles, they don't make many alarm calls. But you know who makes even fewer alarm calls? The 1 year males and the adult males. But who makes all the alarm calls? The 1 year and adult females. Because who is related to everybody in those populations? The adult females and 1 year females. Who is only related to a few individuals? The males. Because once they hit adolescence, they're out of here. So they're only going to be related to their kids. So we see in terms of Hamilton's rule, right? I should have had Hamilton's rule pop up on screen here so we can do it again. Pretend that rule, RB greater than C, right? For adult females, the R is very high because they're related to a lot of people. And the capital B is also very high because there's a lot of individuals that can benefit from that alarm call. Now, for the males, if they make an alarm call, the same number of individuals can benefit, right? So the capital B is still going to be high. But what's the relatedness? The relatedness is way low, right? Their average coefficient of relatedness is pretty much zero. So the males don't satisfy the inequity, right? RB is not greater than C for the males, but it is for the females. This distribution that we see here is exactly what we would predict from Hamilton's rule. It matches exactly what the math tells us the behaviors should be and what their frequencies should be. It's beautiful. I cannot emphasize enough just how much this is a beautiful prediction where we have this theory, we have the math that says this is what should happen. And we go out in the real world and boom, we have data that exactly match what we would expect to be the case if our underlying theory behind our predictions was correct. And that's the answer, right? That is a confirmed prediction that is just spot on. And like, that is it. We joke about the phrase gold standard, right? This is the gold standard, accurate predictions, right? We make a very specific hypothesis about how we can explain this behavior. And we say, if this hypothesis is true, these are the data we're going to find out in the real world. And then boom, we find those exact data, exactly what we would expect. It's beautiful. Now, I'm not going to go through other cases like this because like there's math we could do to get into it, but you can actually do the same type of thing for other mating systems, right? Rather than the males dispersing, you could do it for like the eusocial insects like bees or termites or ants and like haplodiploid systems where the males are haploid and the females are diploid. And like you could do the same math and it works the same way. You get the same results where what you see in the real world matches your predictions. It's so cool. And like, one thing I want everybody to take away from this is just like how precisely the real world matches the predictions we make based on that very simple equation that I showed you. It's really, really cool. And I hope I'm conveying my enthusiasm for this to everybody. Man, it is super cool how this works. So let me bring this thing home here, okay? The thing that we talked about here is that one, genes can influence behaviors. And that means that some behaviors can evolve through selection. If there are specific alleles that can promote specific behaviors, those behaviors can be selected for or selected against. So, right, we can affect the frequency of those behaviors via selection. And one such behavior is altruism, right? We can select for altruism via this phenomenon called kin selection. And again, to just briefly summarize what's going on here, it's really simple once you think about it. Close relatives share your alleles. So if altruistic behaviors increase the frequency of altruism promoting alleles indirectly, that is to say, in the offspring of other people, by a greater magnitude than they decrease their frequency directly, your own offspring, the altruism will be selected for, right? The frequency of those alleles will increase in that population despite the direct fitness costs to the individual who exhibits that behavior. It is so cool. I see we have this question, so it's not hang on. So it's not the allele frequency of the population that increases, but individuals. It's the allele frequency in the population will increase, but rather than like we typically think of fitness like my fitness, right? I have more kids, my fitness goes up. But instead of thinking about the fitness in terms of the individual, we're thinking about it in terms of the frequency of specific alleles, right? And the representation of that allele is going to go up, not from me to my kids, but from my relatives to their kids, because I help them through my altruistic behavior. And even if that costs me my own fitness, whatever the magnitude of that decrease is, the magnitude of the increase in my relatives is greater. So those alleles still increase in frequency in spite of that cost. Did that answer the question? Did that clarify for everybody? Let me know if that clarified. And yes, this is an important point here. And this is something I always forget to point out, or I often forget to point out, is that we're talking about relative fitness. And almost always when we're talking about this stuff, we're talking about relative fitness. I always think about fitness. This is just how I think of things. I always think about fitness in the context of the population, right? If your fitness goes up, that means you have more fitness, more representation in the next generation relative to other members of your population, right? That's just kind of where my headspace always is. And that's a good point that everyone should just keep that in mind. That's what we're talking about here. Thank you, Zach. All right, so that wraps up our discussion of the evolution of altruism. So next time, let's just preview what we're going to do here because, like I said, this was part two in this three-part series. In part one, we talked about the evolution of virulence. In part two, today, we talked about the evolution of altruistic behavior. Next time, next week, that's next Wednesday, that's going to be July 24th at 9 p.m. right here on my channel. We are going to build on these two topics. Like I said at the beginning, it's not three unrelated topics. These things all go together, and we're going to see next week exactly how they go together. So we're going to take what we talked about with virulence, we're going to take what we talked about today with altruism, and we are going to kind of put these things together, and that's going to help us understand the evolutionary dynamics of cancer. Why does cancer develop the way it does? Why does it do the things it does? We can actually explain that using evolutionary theory. In order to do it, we had to first talk about virulence evolution and the evolution of altruism. So now that we've set that foundation, we can come back next week and we're going to explain the evolutionary dynamics of cancer. I promise you, it is super interesting. And we are going to think about things in a way that you've never thought of them before. We are going to start by talking about multicellularity in a way that I think many of you have never thought about multicellularity before. We're just going to turn it on its head and start from a completely different place. And things are going to thunk into place, and these dynamics are going to explain cancer. It's going to be super cool, and I'm really excited. So that is what we are going to do next week. Thank you all for being here. Before you leave, if you would be so kind, please make sure you hit that like button on your way out, and also like leave a comment, share this video. I want more people to see this stuff because like this stuff is just super cool, and like I want more people to be as enthusiastic about this as I am. So if you know anybody who you think would think this is interesting, please share this stuff and try to convince more people that biology and specifically evolutionary biology is the best science. And that's where I'm going to leave it for tonight, everybody. Thank you all for being here, and I will see you all next week. And we will do this one more time. It's going to be super cool. Have a great night, everyone.